Thank you, Clara, and thank you, Jonathan. And hope you can all hear me. I don't have a very strong voice this evening, but I'll do my best. So I am Imogen Giles. I'm the French and Latin teacher at Summers-Knoll. I'm English, but when I'm not in this country, my home is in France. I've been teaching for 30 years, 15 of which have been at Summers-Knoll. And in fact, I began the Latin program at our dear school. So I teach everyone in the school from preschool all the way through to 8th grade, Latin all the way through, and French begins in 1st grade. What is really special, I think, is that there is no other school in Ann Arbor or in Michigan or in the country that begins with such very young children and that beautiful classical language of Latin. We begin in the preschool, and I'm going to just propose a couple of reasons why we begin so young and also why we study Latin as well. So first of all, I think as all teachers know and all parents know, young children are endlessly curious, and this is something Clara referred to. We all know that their favorite word is probably why. Why, and then perhaps who and when and so on. They are curious, they want to know. So my feeling is if they want to know and they want to learn, why not start at that level in preschool? So that's what we do. We start very gently with a story time. It gives me the chance to get to know the preschoolers. And since they're going to be with me all the way through to 8th grade, it's really nice for me to know them at that early stage and then follow them through as they develop and grow all the way through till they graduate. I'm sorry, I don't have much voice this evening. I'm doing my best here. The other reason is I would say that we are very, very enthusiastic about collaboration in our school. And teaching the preschoolers Latin means I can collaborate with Val, who runs the preschool program at the moment with Thea and Ari. And when they finish with the ancient Egyptians, they are going on to the country of Greece. And this means that I can collaborate with Val. We can introduce a little bit of history and culture to do with the ancient Greeks. They already know some ancient Greek as well as some Latin. So we've had a lot of fun with that. Preschool Latin depends on stories pretty much. And I'm going to echo something Clara said earlier on. Our main source for it is Ovid's Metamorphoses. The Metamorphoses are all about change. Rocks change, but people and nature change too. Ovid, a Roman poet, wrote 10 books of poetry in Latin based on Greek mythology. Each book is at least 800 lines long in Latin poetry, and each book is full of the most wonderful stories trying to answer the question, why? The question every preschooler has on his or her lips. Why do we have certain types of tree? Why do we have insects? Why is it bad perhaps to be arrogant but good to be proud? The Metamorphoses are full of messages and stories, explanations, attempts to explain the world around us. With these very young children, we're not learning Latin grammar, of course, we're learning words, usually Latin words that give us English words. So for example, we will learn the word arbor, which is the Latin word for tree. And of course, our city is an arbor tree city. We will learn words like, canis, dog, gives us the word canine. So with preschoolers, we're learning little words, a few at a time, that occur in the stories we hear from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this gives them the start on the journey they're going to take all the way through to 8th grade. And I'll talk a bit about that process anon. So this is why we start young, because they can start young, because they are curious, because they want to know what the ancient Greeks thought dolphins said. They now know that the ancient Greeks thought dolphins said mimu, and that a frog said brekakakex. They know that the Latin word for a mouse is mus, but the plural is not musses, it's mures. So they begin a journey with language, and because they are so very young and full of curiosity, are not so self-conscious as older children can be. They are very ready to accept and expand and learn. I would say also at this point that Latin is a language that has a very clear structure. So we learn it, of course, because it is the root of the so-called Romance languages. That is, the languages that come from the people of Rome. The language of the people of Rome was Latin. Nothing to do with hearts and flowers and red roses. It's all to do with Rome. So French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese, they all come from Latin. So Latin is the root. That's important because whichever language you learn later on in life or currently at school, whether it's French or Spanish or whatever, Latin gives you a clear and very logical structure. Nearly all the grammatical rules apply. So it gives you a really firm base for taking another language later in your life or at school where the rules may not always apply all of the time. It gives you a concrete understanding of the structures, and then as you advance and change, you can have the courage and the understanding to take that change on board and to cope with it. Latin has also given us the most tremendous literary heritage. Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot, even J.K. Rowling have benefited from all the wonderful stories, the literature, the history, the philosophy. Jonathan mentioned philosophy. When our preschoolers say why, they are being philosophers. Why? The eternal question. So Latin is an important subject in so many ways, but it also gives us a context, a historical context for things that are important to our lives now. For example, in this country, we have a Senate and we have senators. Who had senates and senators? The Romans. Once they gave up with their tyrannical kings that were unpredictable, they started to have a republic. And they made the Senate and the senators bring a little bit more of a democratic process to their style of government. Equally, and this may come as a surprise, this is something I'm working on with the 5th and 6th graders at the moment. Roman authors were very conscious, even though we're going back thousands of years now, of climate change, even then. Pliny, a Roman lawyer who wrote many, many letters which were published, wrote a letter in which he showed deep, deep concern for the fact that the river Anio, which is now called Aniene in Italian, the river Anio during his time was flooding repeatedly and flooding to such an extent that houses were being swept away and whole herds of cattle. He was worried that the normal pattern of seasonal change was somehow being disrupted. And he expresses this in a letter, a Latin letter, which I'm translating at the moment with the 5th and 6th graders. So there's nothing new here. There's nothing new on the earth. We're still facing problems now that the ancients, the Romans and Greeks, were aware of themselves. And I think that's important. I think when you study Latin, it gives you an idea of the development of us as human beings and the problems we face. It gives you a context and a historical background in order to situate ourselves. So Latin gives us a tremendous legacy, and although it's not a language we choose to speak most of the time, we choose to learn it to have access to all this wonderful history and tragedy and comedy. It is a language that enriches our lives. I've said we don't speak it, but in fact, my 5th and 6th graders recently produced a presentation all in Latin and with some classical Greek to illustrate the messages of Book 9 of the Odyssey. But I need to come back to preschool and kindergarten. So I'm going to give you a little idea of what we do in preschool Latin. I've given you a suggestion. I would like to expand it a bit more. And then I'm going to talk about what happens with Clara's class. That's the young fives in the kindergarten. So in preschool, we start with stories in English first, stories that are about nature and also about the values that we as humans hold dear: gratitude, kindness, courage. We then move to Aesop's fables. These are often about animals, and the children love animals, and they know a lot about animals through work they've done in preschool with Val and her assistants. We then move on to an introduction to the work of Ovid, because there's so much material there. I can introduce it in preschool and carry on for the rest of the school because there's 15 books of the stuff. We'll move on to the metamorphoses, to the stories there. And that's when the children get to learn some Latin words. They get to learn to know the singulars and plurals of nouns. They are, though they're not aware of it, embarking on their first grammatical step, singulars and plurals of Latin nouns. As we move into young fives and kindergarten, we expand our knowledge of those stories and we add a lot of craft and art. So, for example, when I was telling the story of Athena and Arachne earlier this year in Clara's class, we did a bit of weaving because Arachne and Athena compete in a weaving competition. Arachne is too arrogant to admit that she may have gained some of her talent from Athene, and so a competition takes place to see who is the best weaver. This gave us a chance to think about weaving and how you can weave a web like a spider, but you can also weave an idea or a plot. So we're looking at the words and what they mean in English, but we're also looking at them in Latin, because Latin does enrich a great deal of our English language, and that's something we develop as a discipline as we go through the years looking at Greek and Latin roots for the translations we do, starting in first grade and going up to 8th grade. So with young fives and kindergarten, we're looking forward to enjoying the stories that are encased within Ovid's Metamorphoses, but we're also looking to make displays, to use craft, to bring those stories to life, to make them memorable for us. We greet each other in Latin at the beginning of our classes, salvete pueri puellaeque, and they say, salvete madame, and magistra, and so on. And we end our classes with a Latin greeting as well. It's our first step on a long and very exciting journey. And another reason for us starting so very early with preschool, I would say, is that it gives us so much time to learn in depth. We don't have to view learning Latin as a quick grammatical exercise because we want to get to a certain standard by the time we get to high school. We can take our time. It's not a race. We can dig deep into it. We can enjoy the language and all the literature that it offers us, and we can take our time to build our skills little by little, step by step, in a way that's fun and interesting and engaging. At the end of the young five and kindergarten year, I introduce French because that is the language that the first graders will add to Latin. So once they get into first grade, it's 1 class of Latin a week and 2 classes of French a week. And this pattern stays the same until they get to 5th grade. And then it's 2 classes of French a week and 2 classes of Latin a week, each individual class, 50 minutes each. Yeah. I'd like to just say very, very briefly, because I can see time is marching on, what happens currently in our Latin classes going up from 1st to 8th grade, just very quickly, so you can see how the development of the process works and some of the other things we do. So 1st and 2nd grade, this is when we really start to translate, and we take simple sentences, 1 verb, 1 noun, 1 adjective. This is in complement to the work they're doing in their homeroom with their homeroom teacher, Barbara. They all know what adjectives are. They can define them. They know what verbs and nouns are. And I can reinforce that when we do simple translations, 3 words, Latin verb, Latin noun, Latin adjective. At the moment, we're working on Hercules' 12 labors. Each labor shows a different aspect of Hercules' character. We discuss that together and see what adjective we want to come up with in English, and then we translate a sentence, verb and noun, Hercules est, we add our Latin adjective. So they're learning noun, verb, adjective in Latin without even realizing they're embracing quite tricky points of Latin grammar, actually. When we get into 3rd and 4th grade, so I'll have to have something to drink here. Sorry, no voice. We start to think about Latin history, and this can mean a collaboration with the homeroom teacher because she's been working on constitutional issues and how one form of government changes into another. Sorry, I'm losing my voice now, so I'm going to be quite quick to get towards the end. Excuse me. When we get into 5th and 6th grade, we're really serious about our Latin grammar, but also about our source material. So I've mentioned Pliny's letters to you this evening. We're working on a number of Pliny's letters. They're to do with all aspects of Roman life, with the practice of law, with the practice of government, with nature, with how Romans managed their households, what Roman travel was like. It was pretty difficult, actually, and quite painful in many cases. No suspension on your chariots or your coaches when you are traveling. We talk about that, we learn about that, and all through the medium of language, and all the time we're thinking about the Greek and Latin roots of the words we translate. When we hop into 7th and 8th grade, we're really honing our skills for high school. Currently, the 7th and 8th grades are finishing looking at how two sources or one subject can show different perspectives. So we're looking at a Greek source, the Iliad, a Roman source, the Aeneid, looking at the last year of the Trojan War. Depending on whether you're a Roman, that's the Aeneid, or a Greek, the Iliad, your view of the events and the characters is completely different. So we're really thinking about how individual experience can alter your perception and how your perception can be radically different from someone else's. And I think that's an important thing. We're using Latin as our medium, but I think this is important for everybody. I know we're getting close. Can I just say a quick word about French, Jonathan? Okay, thanks. So, I should say also, for everything we do in Latin and French, we follow the Michigan standards of culture, communication, connection, and comparison. So we are loyal to those standards, but we also layer on top, in this gradual process from preschool to 8th grade, a lot of, I will call it project work. Sometimes it's collaboration with homeroom teachers. Sometimes it's something like our Latin play we did 5th and 6th graders. 1st and 2nd graders in French, we concentrate a lot on a French educational practice, which is to learn poetry. We're preparing at the moment for a presentation to the whole school on French poems that are about animals, but also set in the context of the environment, and also with all sorts of sneaky things fitting in, like how to tell the time in French, how to greet someone, and so on and so forth. So in one French poem, which they think is about la girafe, a giraffe, we're actually learning about the African savannah and how to say it's midday in French. We're obviously learning the skills of speaking, listening, reading and writing all the way through in everything we do. As we get into 3rd and 4th grade, we're learning how to talk about ourselves, how to introduce someone else. We do a lot of singing and dancing in French, believe it or not. There's a wonderful space in the middle school area of the school where we can sing and dance in French. Have a lot of fun with that. 5th, 6th, and 7th and 8th graders, we continue developing all these skills, but I add something that I think is really important. I mentioned it briefly, Jonathan, and that's something I call flash d'information for the 5th, 6th graders, l'actu for the 7th and 8th graders. This is looking at French news as it's reported currently day by day, looking at headlines and short news reports. We read them and we translate them, and then I can ask questions about them and the children can answer questions. This means they are dealing with up-to-date current French as it's spoken and written and reported, and they're learning something about the world as it's happening now. Nothing too graphic to do with what might be going on in various parts of the world, but things to do with current scientific discoveries, elections. For example, France has a new prime minister at the moment, Gabriel Attal, who's replacing Elizabeth Borne, things like that. New species of animals being discovered, that sort of thing. So sometimes it's just a headline, sometimes it's a whole paragraph, and we're really concentrating on speaking, communicating, and during the latter part of this year, we're going to look at aspects of the French Constitution. There are 5 constitutions, that's why it's called the Fifth Republic now with Emmanuel Macron, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of earlier French history, the Revolution, and how that changed French culture, but also French government. I probably talked too long, but I love French, I love Latin, I love teaching. Thank you so much.